Birmingham, 1817. The assembly rooms had never witnessed such a spectacle. When Edmund Blackwood, Earl of Ravensholme, dropped to one knee before 300 of Birmingham's finest society, every fan stopped fluttering, every conversation ceased. His proposal was eloquent, heartfelt, and utterly public. Arabella Fairweather's refusal was equally public, equally devastating. As the ballroom erupted in scandalized whispers, neither could imagine that 3 days later, every street from the assembly rooms to her front door would be carpeted in roses, creating the most extraordinary apology in English history and transforming their mutual humiliation into the love story Birmingham would remember forever. Now, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The crystal chandeliers of Birmingham's assembly rooms cast their golden light upon the most glittering gathering of the 1817 social season, where silk gowns rustled like autumn leaves, and the careful choreography of Regency society unfolded in all its magnificent complexity. The air thrummed with anticipation, perfumed with lavender water and the subtle scent of beeswax candles, while the gentle strains of a country dance floated above the murmur of 300 conversations conducted in the precise tones that marked breeding and refinement. Against the backdrop of marble columns and gilt-framed mirrors, Birmingham's elite moved through their evening ritual with the practiced grace of those born to such occasions. Yet tonight carried an electric undercurrent of expectation that had even the most jaded society matrons leaning forward in their chairs. At the heart of this social whirlwind stood Miss Arabella Fairweather, her dark auburn hair arranged in an elegant chignon that framed features both striking and intelligent, her green silk gown chosen not for its ability to catch a husband, but for how it complemented her unusual amber eyes that sparkled with wit and independence. At 23, she had successfully navigated 3 London seasons and 2 Birmingham seasons without accepting a single proposal, a feat that had elevated her from curiosity to legend among the gossiping circles of polite society. Unlike her contemporaries who viewed marriage as their primary goal and husband hunting as their chief occupation, Arabella valued intellectual compatibility and genuine affection over social advancement, a perspective that both intrigued and scandalized those around her. Her reputation for sharp wit and unconventional opinions had preceded her into every drawing room, where she was known to discuss Mary Wollstonecraft's writings with the same ease others devoted to the weather, and to express views on female education that would have been considered radical in any company less charmed by her beauty and social grace. The Fairweather family occupied a respectable position in the local gentry, though they lacked the vast fortune that would have made Arabella an automatic prize in the marriage market, a circumstance that had paradoxically freed her to be more selective than her wealthier contemporaries, who faced greater pressure to secure advantageous matches. Her father, Sir Reginald Fairweather, had inherited modest estates and a comfortable income that afforded his family respect but not luxury, while her mother, Lady Constance, harbored ambitions that exceeded their actual circumstances and worried constantly about securing suitable matches for both her daughters before their bloom faded. Tonight, however, the usual social calculations seemed secondary to the atmosphere of barely contained excitement that rippled through the assembly rooms like wind across wheat fields, and Arabella found herself the object of more attention than usual, though she could not quite determine why until she noticed the frequent glances directed toward the entrance where Edmund Blackwood, Earl of Ravensholme, had just appeared like a figure from one of the romantic novels she secretly read in her father's library. At 29, he possessed the kind of masculine beauty that made conversation falter and fans flutter more rapidly, his tall frame elegant in perfectly tailored evening clothes that emphasized broad shoulders and a narrow waist, while his dark hair and aristocratic features would have made him remarkable even without the vast wealth and ancient title that rendered him the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. The Earl had returned to society only recently after spending 2 years in relative seclusion following his inheritance of the title, time devoted to learning the management of extensive estates and the weight of responsibility that came with his position, and his reappearance had caused considerable stir among the marriage-minded families of Birmingham and beyond. What made him particularly intriguing to Arabella, however, was not his wealth or his title, but the intelligence she glimpsed behind his carefully polite social mask, the way his grey eyes seemed to see beyond the surface pleasantries to something deeper and more genuine, and the manner in which he had been quietly observing her for the past several weeks with an attention that suggested appreciation for more than mere beauty. Their first meaningful conversation had occurred 3 weeks ago at Mrs. Pemberton's musical evening, where they had discovered a shared love of literature that transcended the usual social boundaries between unmarried men and women, and their subsequent encounters had revealed a meeting of minds that Arabella found both stimulating and dangerous to her carefully guarded independence. He had asked her opinion on political matters that other men would never have thought to discuss with a woman, listened to her views without the condescending smile she usually encountered, and demonstrated a respect for her intelligence that was as rare as it was attractive. The memory of their last private conversation, stolen on Lady Hartwell's terrace during her card party, still sent warmth through Arabella's chest as she recalled how Edmund had spoken of his hopes for social reform and his belief that education should be available to all classes, views that aligned so closely with her own that she had felt a dangerous flutter of possibility before reminding herself that such perfect compatibility was probably an illusion born of wishful thinking. As the evening progressed through its familiar pattern of dancing, conversation, and careful social positioning, Arabella found herself acutely aware of Edmund's presence across the room, the way he moved through the crowd with easy confidence, yet seemed somehow apart from the calculated socializing that surrounded him, and how his gaze found hers repeatedly across the crowded space with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her determination to remain level-headed about his interest. During their waltz, which had been arranged with the proper attention to social form, yet felt thrillingly intimate as his gloved hand guided her through the steps, they had engaged in a spirited discussion of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a conversation that would have scandalized any eavesdropper, but which revealed the depth of Edmund's progressive thinking and his genuine respect for women's intellectual capacity. The dance had ended far too quickly, leaving Arabella breathless not from the exertion, but from the dangerous realization that she was developing feelings for a man whose social position made him simultaneously the most desirable and the most dangerous potential suitor she could possibly attract. After the dance, Edmund had maneuvered them toward the terrace doors with the skill of a practiced diplomat, and in the relative privacy of Lady Pemberton's rose garden, he had revealed a side of himself that few in society ever glimpsed, speaking passionately about his responsibilities to his tenants and his desire to use his wealth and position for meaningful reform rather than mere personal pleasure. The moonlight had transformed his features into something almost ethereal, and when he had taken her hand to help her down the garden steps, the contact had sent electricity through her entire body, a sensation both thrilling and terrifying in its intensity. Their conversation had touched on subjects that proper young ladies were not supposed to contemplate, yet Edmund had seemed to assume her capability for serious thought as naturally as he might assume her ability to breathe, and this casual respect for her intellect had affected her more profoundly than any conventional compliment ever could. When they had returned to the ballroom, Arabella had been conscious of the speculative glances that followed them, the way conversations paused as they passed, and the particular attention Lady Vivian Ashworth paid to their interaction with eyes that glittered with something that might have been jealousy or calculation or both. The evening had concluded with Edmund requesting another dance, a request she had been forced to decline according to the strict rules of propriety that limited unmarried couples to 2 dances per evening, though the regret in his eyes had mirrored her own as he bowed and retreated to join his friend Lord Jasper Thornfield near the card tables. The second chapter of this evening's drama began to unfold as the musicians prepared for the evening's final set, when a curious stillness seemed to settle over the assembly rooms like morning mist over a lake, and conversations gradually faded as attention focused on Edmund's movement toward the center of the ballroom, with purposeful strides that suggested some momentous intention. Arabella felt her breath catch in her throat as she recognized the determined set of his shoulders and the way his jaw tightened with resolve, while around her the assembled company seemed to sense that they were about to witness something extraordinary, their fans stilling and their voices dropping to whispers as Edmund raised his hand to request the musicians' attention. The silence that followed was complete and expectant, broken only by the soft rustle of silk and the distant sound of carriages in the street outside, while every eye in the room fixed upon the Earl as he surveyed the assembled company with the gravity of a man about to make a speech that would change everything. Arabella's heart began to pound with a rhythm that seemed to echo in her ears as she realized with growing horror what Edmund intended to do, the romantic gesture that would transform their private understanding into public spectacle and force her hand in a manner that violated every principle of choice and autonomy she held dear. When he dropped to one knee in the exact center of the ballroom floor, his grey eyes finding hers across the sea of astonished faces, she felt the walls of social expectation closing around her like a prison pit, trapping her between the impossible choice of accepting a proposal she had never invited or rejecting a man she cared for in front of 300 witnesses who would judge them both for the rest of their lives. His words, when they came, were everything a proposal should be, eloquent and heartfelt, speaking of his admiration for her mind as well as her beauty and promising her the intellectual freedom within marriage that most women could only dream of. Yet every syllable felt like another bar in the cage he was unknowingly constructing around her with his public declaration. The proposal itself was a masterpiece of romantic expression, acknowledging her unusual intelligence and independent spirit, while offering her a partnership of equals rather than the traditional subjugation of wife to husband. But the very public nature of the gesture transformed what should have been an intimate moment into a performance that reduced her to an unwilling actress in a drama she had never agreed to join. The ballroom held its collective breath as Arabella stood frozen in her position near the refreshment table, acutely conscious of every eye upon her, and the weight of expectation that pressed down like a physical force, while her mind raced through the impossible calculations of a situation that offered no good choices, only varying degrees of social catastrophe. To accept would be to reward Edmund's manipulation of her circumstances, however well-intentioned, and to establish a precedent that suggested her consent could be assumed rather than requested, while to refuse would damage both their reputations and subject them to months or perhaps years of social speculation and gossip that would follow them like a persistent shadow. The silence stretched on, heavy with tension and anticipation, until Arabella realized that her hesitation was itself becoming part of the spectacle, and with quiet dignity that belied the turmoil in her heart, she stepped forward to face Edmund with the composure that had served her through countless social challenges. Her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly through the silent room, despite its soft tone, and her words fell upon the assembly like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward in ever-widening circles of disbelief. "My lord, I am honored by your regard. but I cannot accept a proposal made more for the audience than for the recipient," she said, each word carefully chosen to convey respect for Edmund while maintaining her own dignity, though she could see the pain that flickered across his features as her rejection registered. The curtsy that followed was perfectly executed, a masterpiece of social grace that somehow managed to acknowledge his honor while asserting her independence. And as she turned to leave the ballroom with measured steps that betrayed none of her inner anguish, the silence behind her erupted into a cacophony of whispers and exclamations that would fuel Birmingham's gossip mills for months to come. Her retreat from the assembly rooms required every ounce of courage and composure she possessed. As she made her way through the crowd that parted before her like water before the prow of a ship, conscious of the stares that followed her progress, and the conversations that resumed in her wake with an intensity that spoke of social scandal of the highest order. The journey home through Birmingham's gaslit streets passed in a blur of silence, broken only by the clip-clop of horses' hooves and the rattle of carriage wheels over cobblestones, while Arabella sat rigid with shock beside her mother, whose silence was more ominous than any explosion of reproach could have been. Lady Constance's face had gone white with a combination of social embarrassment and maternal disappointment, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke of conversations yet to come, and recriminations that would echo through the Fairweather household for weeks. When they finally reached the modest elegance of Fairweather House, with its ivy-covered facade and welcoming windows glowing with candlelight, Arabella felt a desperate desire to run to her room and hide from the consequences of her decision, yet she knew that escape was impossible when her choice would affect not only herself, but her entire family's social standing. The explosion came the moment the front door closed behind them, as Lady Constance's carefully maintained composure crumbled into a torrent of anguish and recrimination that echoed through the entrance hall like a storm breaking over the moors. "How could you refuse him, Arabella? How could you humiliate the Earl of Ravensholme in front of all of Birmingham society?" her mother cried, her usual attention to propriety abandoned in the face of what she clearly saw as social and financial disaster. "Do you have any idea what you have done to our family's reputation, to your sister's chances, to everything we have worked so hard to achieve?" The words tumbled out in a rush of panic and disappointment, while Sir Reginald stood silent in the doorway of his study, his expression revealing confusion rather than anger as he struggled to understand why his sensible daughter had made such an apparently irrational choice. Only Penelope, sweet and understanding despite her youth, seemed to grasp the complexity of Arabella's position, slipping her arm through her sister's as Lady Constance continued her lamentations and offering silent support that meant more than any words could convey. The night that followed was one of the longest in Arabella's memory, spent pacing her bedroom floor while her mind replayed every moment of the evening's disaster, questioning her decision while simultaneously knowing that she could not have acted differently without betraying everything she believed about the importance of choice and consent in matters of the heart. Meanwhile, across town in his elegant townhouse, Edmund faced his own reckoning with the help of his closest friend, Lord Jasper Thornfield, whose gentle questioning helped him understand the magnitude of his miscalculation and the way his romantic gesture had inadvertently trapped the very woman he had hoped to honor. As dawn approached, both protagonists sat alone with their thoughts, each contemplating the wreckage of their reputations and wondering if their chance for happiness had been destroyed forever by a single moment of misguided romance in Birmingham's grandest ballroom. The morning sun cast long shadows across Birmingham's industrial quarter when Edmund Blackwood first ventured into the narrow streets where coal smoke perpetually darkened the brick buildings, and the sounds of machinery echoed from dawn until well past dusk, his fine clothes and obvious gentility marking him as clearly out of place among the working families who called this crowded district home. For 3 weeks since his awkward but promising conversation with Arabella behind the garden wall, Edmund had tormented himself with the realization that every gesture he had made in pursuit of her affections had been fundamentally selfish, designed more to showcase his own romantic devotion than to demonstrate any real understanding of her character or values. The roses had wilted and been cleared away, leaving behind only gossip and the lingering embarrassment of a grand gesture that had impressed society while entirely missing its intended mark. And Edmund found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about courtship, love, and what it truly meant to win a woman's heart. Through careful inquiry and observation, he had learned of Arabella's passionate interest in education for the children of Birmingham's working poor, a cause she supported not through fashionable charity events attended by society ladies, but through direct involvement with existing schools and teachers who struggled with inadequate resources and overwhelming need. The discovery had initially filled him with the familiar urge to make a grand gesture, perhaps announcing a magnificent donation at a public gathering where his generosity would be witnessed and applauded. But his recent humiliations had taught him the folly of seeking to impress rather than genuinely serve. Instead, he had begun his work in secret, using intermediaries and anonymous donations to avoid any appearance of seeking credit or recognition, starting with the identification of a suitable building in the heart of the industrial district where a proper school might be established, with adequate space for both classroom instruction and the practical workshops that would prepare working-class children for skilled trades. The negotiations to purchase and renovate the building had required weeks of careful planning and substantial financial investment, but Edmund found himself more energized by this project than by any of his usual pursuits, discovering unexpected satisfaction in the practical challenges of creating something genuinely useful rather than merely impressive. Working with local craftsmen and teachers who understood the neighborhood's specific needs, he had overseen the transformation of a former warehouse into bright, well-ventilated classrooms equipped with proper desks, books, and materials that would give these children educational opportunities previously available only to their social superiors. The secrecy required constant vigilance to ensure that his involvement remained hidden from both society gossips and the families who would benefit from the school, as he was determined that his assistance should be valued for its own merit rather than dismissed as another romantic stratagem or accepted merely because of his title and wealth. When fever began to spread through Birmingham's poorest quarters, with the devastating speed that characterized epidemic disease in overcrowded living conditions, where proper sanitation and medical care remained luxuries beyond most families' reach, Edmund found himself confronting an opportunity to serve that tested both his resolve and his character in ways that society drawing rooms had never demanded. Dr. Harrison. The dedicated physician who had been treating the growing number of patients despite his own limited resources and increasing exhaustion, had mentioned the crisis during a chance encounter at his club, and Edmund had immediately recognized the chance to provide meaningful assistance without the complications of romantic motivation that had characterized his previous attempts to demonstrate his worthiness. The work proved far more demanding than Edmund had anticipated, requiring him to venture into crowded tenements where entire families lived in single rooms and the sick lay alongside the healthy for lack of any alternative arrangement, while the constant risk of contagion tested his courage in ways that facing Napoleon's cannons during his military service had not prepared him for. Yet something in the desperate gratitude of mothers watching their children recover from near-fatal fevers and the quiet satisfaction of Dr. Harrison when adequate medicine finally became available proved more rewarding than any social triumph Edmund had ever achieved through his wealth and position. Day after day he worked alongside the physician, using his connections to procure scarce medicines and his wealth to provide food and clean water to families too poor to afford proper nutrition during their recovery, while learning more about genuine human suffering and resilience than his privileged upbringing had ever taught him. The physical demands of the work left him exhausted each evening, his fine clothes permanently stained and his hands roughened by unfamiliar labor. Yet he had never felt more purposeful or more worthy of the advantages that birth and fortune had bestowed upon him. Through this service, he began to understand what Arabella had tried to tell him about the difference between genuine consideration for others and the elaborate gestures that ultimately served his own emotional needs rather than addressing any real problems in the world around him. The anonymity he maintained was crucial not only for avoiding the appearance of romantic calculation, but also for ensuring that his assistance would continue to be welcomed by families who might otherwise feel uncomfortable accepting charity from the same Earl whose romantic pursuits had made him a figure of public curiosity and gossip. It was during one of her own charitable visits to the afflicted district that Arabella first encountered unmistakable evidence of Edmund's involvement in the relief efforts. Her surprise at finding him emerging from a tenement building with Dr. Harrison giving way to dawning understanding as she observed the easy familiarity between the two men that spoke of sustained collaboration rather than casual involvement. The transformation in Edmund's appearance was striking, his usual immaculate grooming replaced by the practical dress of someone engaged in serious work, while his manner had acquired a gravity and purposefulness that contrasted sharply with the somewhat theatrical quality that had characterized their previous interactions. Dr. Harrison's casual reference to Edmund's weeks of service and his obvious gratitude for assistance that had saved numerous lives provided confirmation that this was no recent attempt to impress her, but a sustained commitment that had begun well before their reconciling conversation behind her garden wall. As she watched Edmund interact with the recovering families, Arabella saw none of the slightly artificial charm that had marked his behavior in society settings, replaced instead by a natural warmth and genuine concern that seemed to spring from authentic compassion rather than social calculation. The sight of him listening patiently to an elderly woman's detailed account of her grandson's recovery, his attention completely focused on her words rather than scanning the surroundings for witnesses to his benevolence, provided the kind of insight into his character that no amount of elaborate courtship could have revealed. During their brief encounter outside the makeshift clinic, Edmund's obvious embarrassment at being discovered suggested that his desire for secrecy had been genuine rather than strategic, while his awkward attempt to deflect her questions about his involvement confirmed that he had learned something valuable from the failure of his previous grand gestures. For the first time since their acquaintance began, Arabella found herself seeing Edmund not as the confident Earl whose romantic pursuits had made her the center of unwanted attention, but as a man capable of growth and genuine service to others. And the discovery created a fundamental shift in her feelings that she was not yet prepared to acknowledge, even to herself. The conversation that followed was brief and slightly stilted, as both struggled to navigate this new dynamic, where Edmund's actions spoke more eloquently than his words had ever managed to do. Yet Arabella departed with a growing sense that perhaps she had been too hasty in her judgment of his character and motivations. Over the following days, she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the image of Edmund working quietly alongside Dr. Harrison, his attention focused entirely on the genuine needs of others rather than on creating impressive spectacles designed to win her admiration, and she began to question whether her resistance to his courtship had been based more on wounded pride than on accurate assessment of his true nature. As October advanced and Birmingham's brief period of romantic celebrity began to fade with the last of Edmund's roses, an enterprising local merchant named Mr. Wickham conceived what he grandly announced as the first annual Birmingham Rose Festival, designed to celebrate the unprecedented romantic gesture before its memory faded entirely into the realm of local legend and gossip. What began as a modest proposal to preserve some of the wilted roses as pressed flowers for commemorative purposes quickly expanded into an elaborate weekend celebration that threatened to draw visitors from throughout the Midlands, complete with flower exhibitions, romantic poetry readings, and dancing in the assembly rooms, where Edmund's original disaster had unfolded weeks earlier. The announcement of the festival filled both Arabella and Edmund with equal measures of horror and disbelief as they realized that their personal embarrassment was about to become the centerpiece of a public celebration that would ensure their story achieved a permanence in local folklore that even time would struggle to diminish. Mrs. Pemberton and the other society matrons seized upon the festival as an opportunity to extend their role as arbiters of the romantic drama that had provided such delicious entertainment, while merchants throughout Birmingham recognized the commercial potential of an event that promised to bring free-spending visitors to their establishments in unprecedented numbers. Arabella found herself besieged by well-meaning friends and neighbors, eager to ensure her participation in what they viewed as a celebration of her romantic triumph, their assumption that she would naturally wish to be honored as the inspiration for Birmingham's greatest love story, filling her with a dismay she struggled to conceal behind polite protestations about the unseemly nature of such public attention. Edmund faced similar pressure from various quarters, with everyone from his estate manager to his former military colleagues expressing amazement that he would not wish to bask in the glory of having created the most talked-about romantic gesture in recent memory, their incomprehension at his reluctance suggesting that they viewed his courtship as a social triumph, rather than the personal disaster he knew it to represent. The irony that their shared horror at becoming unwilling festival honorees provided the first genuine common ground they had discovered was not lost on either of them, as they found themselves united in mortification at the spectacle being created around their private emotions and mutual misunderstandings. The festival weekend arrived with unseasonably warm weather that seemed to mock their hopes that rain might discourage attendance, as visitors poured into Birmingham from neighboring counties with the enthusiasm of pilgrims approaching a shrine, all eager to witness the scenes of the legendary romance and perhaps catch glimpses of the famous lovers themselves. Local entrepreneurs had seized the opportunity with remarkable creativity, offering everything from pressed rose souvenirs to guided tours of the famous flower path, while poets of varying skill levels had composed verses celebrating the power of true love to transform ordinary city streets into passages of romance. Arabella and Edmund found themselves reluctantly drawn together by the practical necessities of managing their unwanted celebrity with something approaching dignity, their shared desire to minimize the spectacle requiring unprecedented cooperation and mutual consideration. The conversations necessary to coordinate their public appearances during the festival weekend proved surprisingly easy and productive, revealing a compatibility in their approaches to social challenges that had been obscured by the romantic tension and mutual misunderstanding that had characterized their previous interactions. Working together to navigate the festival's demands while maintaining appropriate boundaries between them demonstrated the very qualities that had initially attracted them to each other, their combined intelligence and social skill proving effective in managing even this unprecedented situation. During the public events they were obliged to attend, they presented a united front that satisfied the romantic expectations of their audience, while carefully avoiding any appearance of encouraging the speculation about their relationship status that continued to dominate local conversation. The evening dance at the assembly rooms, held in the same location where Edmund's disastrous proposal had unfolded, provided a particularly challenging test of their ability to work together. As every eye in the room watched for signs of romantic development, while they struggled to behave with appropriate friendliness without either encouraging or discouraging the gossip that surrounded them. Their successful navigation of the festival's social landmines suggested a potential partnership that neither had previously recognized, while their shared relief when the weekend finally concluded created a sense of accomplishment that felt remarkably like genuine friendship for the first time since their acquaintance began. Just as the festival's conclusion seemed to offer hope for a return to some semblance of normal social life, and the possibility that Arabella and Edmund might continue developing their newfound mutual respect without the pressure of constant public attention, Lady Vivian Ashworth launched what proved to be her most calculated and destructive attack on their developing understanding. Her frustration at Edmund's continued lack of interest in renewing their former connection had been building throughout the festival weekend, particularly as she observed the easy cooperation between him and Arabella during their public appearances, and she recognized that direct criticism of their behavior would no longer find the receptive audience it had enjoyed during the immediate aftermath of the rose gesture. Instead, she chose a more subtle approach that targeted the very trust and understanding that had begun to develop between them, using carefully planted suggestions and half-truths to create doubt where confidence had started to grow. At a seemingly innocent tea party hosted by Mrs. Pemberton, Lady Vivian began her campaign with casual observations about Arabella's behavior during the festival, noting how comfortable she had appeared receiving attention from various gentlemen visitors and how skillfully she had managed to keep all her admirers interested while committing to none. The implications were carefully crafted to suggest that Arabella had been using the romantic notoriety created by Edmund's pursuit to attract other suitors, playing the role of tragic heroine to gather sympathy and attention from men who saw her as a challenge worth conquering. Lady Vivian's talent for social manipulation had been honed through years of navigating society's complex hierarchies, and she deployed her skills with surgical precision, never making direct accusations that could be challenged, but instead raising questions and planting doubts that would grow in the minds of her listeners. Her suggestions that Arabella had been seen in intimate conversation with young Mr. Hartwell during the festival, or that she had accepted flowers from the visiting Mr. Pemberton with suspicious enthusiasm, were delivered with the air of reluctant concern rather than malicious gossip, making them more difficult to dismiss or contradict. The rumors she spread were particularly insidious because they contained just enough truth to be believable, while twisting innocent interactions into evidence of calculated flirtation, and within days of their origin, they had spread throughout Birmingham's social circles with the speed that only truly scandalous gossip could achieve. When the whispers finally reached Edmund through his well-meaning friends who thought he should know what people were saying about the woman he had pursued so publicly, the effect was precisely what Lady Vivian had intended, creating doubt and hurt at the moment when trust had finally begun to develop between him and Arabella. The autumn wind carried the last of October's warmth through Birmingham's fashionable quarter, as Jasper Thornfield found himself in the unprecedented position of conducting what amounted to detective work among the drawing rooms and tea tables where society gossip flourished with the persistence of weeds in an untended garden. His growing attachment to Penelope Fairweather had developed naturally through their shared concern for her sister's welfare, and Edmund's increasingly obvious distress, and their mutual determination to protect both Arabella and Edmund from the malicious rumors that had begun to poison Birmingham's social atmosphere, had drawn them into an alliance that felt remarkably like partnership. The whispers about Arabella's supposed encouragement of multiple suitors during the Rose Festival had spread with devastating efficiency through every level of society, and Jasper had watched his oldest friend's newfound confidence and hard-won understanding with Arabella crumble under the weight of doubt and wounded pride that such carefully crafted lies were designed to produce. Penelope's insights into the subtle social dynamics that governed ladies' behavior provided the key to understanding how Lady Vivian had managed to twist innocent courtesy into apparent evidence of duplicity, while Jasper's position as Edmund's closest friend allowed him access to the male perspective on events that might otherwise have remained mysterious. Together, they began to trace the origin and spread of the damaging stories, discovering through careful questioning and observation that every particularly damning detail could be traced back to Lady Vivian's seemingly innocent comments at various social gatherings, her talent for implication and suggestion having created a web of interconnected falsehoods that gained credibility through repetition rather than accuracy. The investigation required delicate maneuvering to avoid appearing to gossip themselves while gathering the evidence needed to expose the systematic campaign that threatened to destroy the fragile trust that had begun to develop between Arabella and Edmund. And both Jasper and Penelope found themselves admiring the other's intelligence and moral courage as they worked to uncover the truth. Their shared meals and long conversations about strategy gradually revealed a compatibility of mind and temperament that neither had expected to find, while their mutual concern for their respective siblings created a foundation of shared values that made deeper affection seem both natural and inevitable. As they pieced together the full scope of Lady Vivian's manipulation, including her role in encouraging Edmund's original public proposal through calculated hints that Arabella admired grand romantic gestures, they began to understand the complex web of social pressures and personal ambitions that had nearly destroyed two people whose only crime had been loving imperfectly while trying to navigate society's treacherous expectations. The revelation of Lady Vivian's comprehensive deception required careful presentation to avoid creating new social upheavals while ensuring that both Edmund and Arabella understood the full extent of the manipulation they had endured. And Jasper chose to approach his friend during one of their regular morning rides when privacy could be assured and emotional reactions would not become public spectacle. The evidence he presented was damning in its thoroughness, demonstrating not only how recent rumors had been manufactured, but also revealing the earlier encouragement Lady Vivian had provided for Edmund's disastrous public proposal. Her suggestions that Arabella would welcome such a dramatic gesture having been based on deliberate misrepresentation rather than any genuine knowledge of Arabella's preferences. Edmund's initial reaction was a mixture of relief at learning that Arabella had not actually been playing with his affections and profound anger at having been manipulated so skillfully by someone he had trusted as a friend, while the full implications of Lady Vivian's scheme gradually revealed the depth of calculation involved in her attempts to engineer both his humiliation and Arabella's social isolation. "I should have recognized the signs," Edmund said, as they paused beside a stream that marked the boundary of his estate, his voice heavy with self-recrimination and dawning understanding. Lady Vivian's advice always seemed to push me toward more dramatic gestures rather than the quieter approaches that might have actually served my purpose, and her encouragement of my public proposal came precisely when I was beginning to doubt the wisdom of such theatricality. Jasper's patient recounting of the evidence he and Penelope had gathered painted a picture of systematic social manipulation that extended far beyond simple romantic rivalry, revealing Lady Vivian as someone willing to destroy others' happiness to serve her own wounded pride and social ambitions. The knowledge that Arabella had faced not only his own misguided courtship, but also a deliberate campaign to undermine her reputation filled Edmund with a new appreciation for her strength and dignity in navigating such treacherous waters, while also reinforcing his growing understanding of how little he had initially comprehended about the social pressures that governed women's lives in their society. As they rode back toward Birmingham, Edmund found himself seeing the entire sequence of events from a new perspective that emphasized Arabella's courage rather than his own romantic disappointments, and for the first time since the rumors had reached his ears, he began to hope that genuine understanding might still be possible between them if he could prove himself worthy of her trust through patience and respect rather than grand gestures and dramatic declarations. Meanwhile, Penelope's conversation with her sister required even more delicate handling, as Arabella had withdrawn into proud silence rather than defending herself against accusations that seemed to strike at the very heart of her integrity and independence. Her refusal to dignify the rumors with detailed denials having only served to make them seem more credible to those inclined to believe the worst. The sisters sat in Arabella's sitting room on a grey November afternoon, the dying light reflecting their sombre moods as Penelope carefully presented the evidence of Lady Vivian's campaign, while watching for signs that her revelations were providing relief rather than additional pain to someone who had already endured more than her share of social persecution. "Bella," Penelope said gently, "you must understand that none of this reflects upon your behavior or character, but rather reveals the lengths to which jealousy and wounded pride will drive someone who cannot bear to see others find happiness that has been denied to her." The proof of Lady Vivian's manipulation was overwhelming, yet Arabella's initial reaction was not relief, but rather a deeper sadness at discovering how thoroughly she had been betrayed by someone she had considered, if not a friend, then at least a fellow member of their social circle whose basic honesty could be trusted. The revelation that her every innocent interaction during the Rose Festival had been carefully observed and deliberately misrepresented created a sense of violation that went beyond simple gossip, while learning that Lady Vivian had also engineered Edmund's original public proposal added layers of complexity to events that Arabella had thought she understood completely. "I believed I was rejecting his presumption in making such a public declaration," Arabella said slowly. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she struggled to process the implications of what Penelope had revealed. "But if he was acting on advice that suggested I would welcome such a gesture, then perhaps my reaction was as unfair as his original approach was inappropriate." The conversation continued through the afternoon as the sisters examined each event and interaction in light of this new information, gradually reconstructing a narrative that emphasized the external pressures and deliberate manipulation that had shaped everyone's behavior rather than the personal failings and character flaws that gossip had suggested. For the first time since the Rose Festival, Arabella began to consider the possibility that Edmund's feelings for her might be genuine rather than simply the product of wounded pride and social pressure, while also recognizing that her own resistance to his courtship had been influenced by the very social dynamics that Lady Vivian had exploited so effectively. As evening approached and their conversation drew to a natural close, Arabella found herself facing the uncomfortable realization that she had allowed others' opinions and expectations to influence her judgment of Edmund's character more than she had been willing to admit, and that perhaps the time had come to give him the opportunity to demonstrate whether he had truly learned from their shared experiences of social manipulation and public humiliation. The approach Edmund chose for his next conversation with Arabella represented everything he had learned about the importance of privacy, respect, and genuine consideration for her feelings, as he requested a formal meeting with Sir Reginald to discuss the possibility of speaking privately with Arabella about their relationship and future prospects. The conversation in Sir Reginald's study was brief and respectful, with Edmund acknowledging both his previous mistakes and his understanding of the social pressures that had complicated their acquaintance, while expressing his hope that Arabella might be willing to hear him speak honestly about his feelings and intentions without the pressure of public attention or family expectations. Sir Reginald, whose bewilderment at the complex social maneuvering that had surrounded his daughter's romantic prospects had only deepened with each new revelation, granted permission for the meeting, while stipulating that Arabella's wishes would be paramount in determining how their conversation proceeded and what, if anything, might develop from it. When Arabella agreed to meet with Edmund in the same study where he had sought her father's permission, the symbolic weight of the location was not lost on either of them, as it represented the most formal and respectful approach possible to a conversation that had the potential to determine their future happiness or provide final closure to their complicated relationship. The November afternoon light filtered through the study's tall windows as they faced each other across the leather-bound silence of Sir Reginald's desk. Both acutely aware that this conversation would either establish a foundation for genuine courtship or provide definitive proof that too much damage had been done for trust to develop between them. "Miss Fairweather," Edmund began, his voice steady, despite the obvious tension he felt. "I come to you today, not with proposals or grand gestures, but with a simple request and an honest admission of my own failures in understanding what true courtship should entail." The words he had rehearsed countless times seemed inadequate as he looked into her intelligent eyes and recognized the wariness that months of social pressure and manipulation had created. Yet he pressed forward with the determination of a man who had finally learned that genuine feeling required genuine expression rather than theatrical display. "I have learned through painful experience that my previous attempts to win your affection were fundamentally selfish, focused more on proving my own devotion than on demonstrating any real understanding of your character or desires," he continued, his honesty creating the intimate atmosphere that had been impossible to achieve during their previous encounters in public settings or emotionally charged circumstances. Arabella listened to Edmund's carefully chosen words with the attention they deserved, recognizing in his changed manner and approach the evidence of genuine growth that she had hoped to find, but had begun to doubt was possible, given the social pressures that seemed to push everyone toward performing expected roles rather than revealing authentic selves. The absence of pressure or expectation in his manner allowed her to respond with equal honesty, acknowledging her own mistakes in allowing others' opinions to influence her judgment of his character while expressing appreciation for the service he had provided to Birmingham's poor during the fever outbreak. "Mr. Blackwood," she said thoughtfully, "I confess that recent revelations about the manipulation we have both endured have caused me to reconsider many of my previous assumptions about your behavior and motivations, and I find myself curious to discover whether we might develop a genuine understanding if freed from the pressure of public attention and social expectation." The conversation that followed was remarkable for its careful honesty and mutual respect, as both acknowledged the attractions they had felt from their first meeting, while also discussing the obstacles that had prevented those feelings from developing naturally. Edmund's request to court her properly, with privacy and patience rather than grand gestures and public declarations, represented everything she had hoped for but had begun to believe impossible in their socially conscious world. "I would be honored to accept your courtship," Arabella replied after careful consideration, "provided we agree that this relationship will develop at a pace that allows us both to truly know each other's character rather than rushing toward engagement based on romantic feeling alone." The relief and genuine happiness that transformed Edmund's features at her acceptance was more affecting than any of his previous theatrical displays of emotion, while the respect he showed for her conditions demonstrated the personal growth that made such acceptance possible. Their agreement to conduct their courtship privately, away from the gossip and speculation that had nearly destroyed their chances for happiness, marked the beginning of a relationship based on mutual understanding rather than social pressure or romantic fantasy, and both left the study with the sense that they had finally found the foundation upon which genuine love might be built through patience, respect, and honest communication about their hopes and fears for the future. 6 months later, the Fairweather garden had recovered from the dramatic events of the previous autumn and bloomed with the natural beauty that came from careful tending rather than theatrical gestures. As a few of Edmund's roses had taken root among the established plantings to create a living reminder of how genuine love could grow from even the most unpromising beginnings. The courtship that had developed between Edmund and Arabella during the winter months had been everything their previous relationship had lacked, conducted with the privacy that allowed authentic feeling to develop, while demonstrating the compatibility of mind and temperament that made lasting partnership possible. Their engagement, announced quietly after Edmund's second proposal, in the very garden where his roses continued to bloom alongside the Fairweather family's carefully cultivated flowers, was celebrated by those who understood that true love required time and understanding to flourish properly. The proposal itself had been intimate and personal, focused entirely on their feelings for each other rather than social expectations or romantic theatre, and Arabella's acceptance had been given with the wholehearted joy that came from knowing she was choosing a partner who respected her intelligence and independence while offering genuine affection and shared values. Their wedding day arrived with the spring sunshine that seemed to bless their union. The rose petals that lined their path from the church having been gathered by friends and family who understood that love expressed through community support was far more meaningful than any grand gesture purchased with gold. As they walked together toward their future, both Edmund and Arabella carried with them the lessons learned through their difficult courtship about the importance of genuine feeling over theatrical display, of patience over pressure, and of respect over manipulation in creating relationships that could withstand the tests of time and social pressure. 1 year later, their marriage had grown into exactly the kind of partnership both had dreamed of, but had feared might be impossible in their socially complicated world, as they worked together on educational initiatives for Birmingham's children that demonstrated how love between equals could benefit not just themselves, but their entire community through the thoughtful application of combined resources and influence toward meaningful change in the world around them.